So this is the second day of our conference, and I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Connie Schulz, who's going to moderate the session.
Okay, thank you, Bill.
Yep.
Well, thank you to Bill and to all of you for coming. And I'm going to do something a little bit more extensive because I thought it would be useful to all of you to know those of us who are the moderators are also have been active in the Southern Association of Women Historians. I'm Connie Schulz. I was for 23 years the director of the public history program at the University of South Carolina. My field was not women's history, but when I was hired at South Carolina, shortly after I arrived, I got a telephone call or a letter from Catherine Clinton saying, well, we are doing this book, this is in the 80s, we're doing this book on important women that's going to be a supplement to American history textbooks, and we need somebody to do a short biographical sketch, portraits of American women, of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, and you're in South Carolina, so you can do that. And that shaped, in some ways, the rest of my professional life, because I wrote 2 more chapters on Eliza Lucas Pinckney and her daughter Harriet Pinckney Oree, one of which is in the University of Georgia Press 3-volume collection of biographies of South Carolina women. And beginning in 2008, I have had grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission to edit. First, we did the women first. Eliza and her daughter Harriet was our first born digital scholarly edition of the Pinckney women, and we're now working on a scholarly born digital edition of the Pinckney men. But SAWH was a really important part of my career, as it is of all of the women who are speaking to you in this symposium. In 1988, we put on the first ever Southern Conference on Women's History at Converse College before Melissa was there, I think. But it was just such an exciting event. A number of books came out of that conference. I was president of SAWH between 1992 and 93. I think part is an outcome of having been the local arrangements and the program committee for that meeting. We were so excited about the 25th anniversary that my graduate students in public history did a series of oral history interviews with the founders of the SAWH, and then Liz Turner and I created a book. It's called Clio's Southern Sisters, or Clio, depending on how you like to pronounce it. And Betsy Jackaway is one of the people who was interviewed for that. It is an important book about not just about the origins of the Southern Association of Women Historians, but also about what it meant to be a woman studying American history and teaching American history in the South. Because each of those women talked not just about their role in founding SAWH, but also how they came to be Southern historians as women. So I recommend this book to you. Because I've taken the time to introduce myself, before I get to the process of introducing our speaker this morning, I want to very briefly tell you something about the moderator of yesterday afternoon session, Betsy Jackaway, because Betsy was an important founder of the SAWH. And I think her career says a lot about the trajectory and the changes in being a woman historian in the South. Betsy has her MA and PhD from the University of Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she's taught many places. The first of which was right here at the University of Florida, where for 3 years she taught in their University College program. But Betsy has been pretty much of her career an independent scholar, an independent historian who has published 6 books. Most recently, Turn Away Thy Son, Little Rock, The Crisis That Shook the Nation. Is that the most recent, if I missed something? But she began with the publication of Yankee Missionaries in the South, the Penn School Experience, published by LSU Press in 1979. And Betsy was very much an important SAWH founder, president, and I think you need to know that about her, although she just stood up and introduced Catherine Clinton. But Betsy is an important SAWH person in her own right. As, of course, is Michele Gillespie. It is my privilege to introduce Michele. Michele was president of the SAWH, and I don't have the date, but the SAWH functions somewhat differently than most of the professional associations. If you're president of the OAH or the AHA or the SHA, at the end of your presidential year, you get up and you have to give a presidential address, which is wonderful. SAWH said, you know, we have wonderful young scholars who are coming along. Instead of making the president, who's been working hard all year, give a talk, let's invite one of the upcoming brilliant young scholars that are coming into our profession to give the talk. And it's usually given at the annual Southern Historical Association meeting. Well, Michele was one of those brilliant young scholars giving a talk in 2007 at the invited speech. Michele is currently the Presidential Endowed Chair of Southern History at Wake Forest University, where she's been on the faculty since 1999. She has been, for the last 2 years, also Dean of the College at Wake Forest. She has published a dozen books, published or co-edited a dozen books. Most recently, the Catherine and J.R. Reynolds, the Partners of Fortune in the Making of the New South, but beginning back with a book on the Devil's Lane, Sex and Race in the Early South, published by Oxford University Press in 1997. You perhaps will know better Neither Lady Nor Slave, Working Women of the Old South, published by UNC Press in 2002. She has been a member of the SAWH since her grad school days. I think that it is that organization which has been the mentorship network that have brought many of the women you will hear today to the positions which they currently hold. And I am very proud to call Michele a friend. And I'll pass this around if any of you want to look at it well. In between.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you. Thank you very much, Connie. I want to be clear, I wrote 2 books and I've co-edited 10 books, and Devil's Lane was with Catherine Clinton, and I just have had just a wonderful career collaborating and working with just fantastic women and very much connected to the SAWH, and I will talk about that in a minute. Well, first of all, I want to do some thanks. I want to thank Bill Link for making this wonderful opportunity to talk about the legacy of 50 years of the SAWH and its impact on Southern history happen, for bringing us all together in this special Milbauer Symposium space, beautiful space, to talk about these histories, experiences, and ideas, and to debate and discuss what they may mean for the next generation of historians, some of whom are sitting right here in front of us. Bill, of course, is an absolutely fabulous historian, but he's also a terrific, amazing mentor to his graduate students and to so many scholars across the field and in this room, including me. So this symposium and its format is one more example of his incredible commitment to the profession. I'm also very grateful to David Meltzner for all his timely logistical help and excellent communications. He's been really quite amazing. And I want to thank Aurelia Auber for her design talents. And I want to thank the faculty and the students. Students are here from Louise Newman's class, I understand, is great, in the history department, who contributed to this terrific event. I want to thank Catherine Clinton. Catherine Clinton has an extraordinary amount of vision and energy, and she really worked so hard to pull all this together with Bill as a critical part of the SAWH's upcoming 50th anniversary. I've known Catherine for that's not right, 32 years now. And while that sounds like a long time, it does feel like it's been pretty close to 52, and indeed my entire lifetime. I always tell the story of what it was like to want to do women's history in graduate school at Princeton behind Catherine, in Catherine's wake, as it were. Every time I would suggest a new paper or thesis topic, my graduate advisors would say, oh, well, Catherine did that every time, including, and she reminded us last night about Maria Westman Chapman. I went to Jim McPherson, he said, oh, Catherine did that. Thank you very much. Eventually, I just gave up, I hate to admit that, and moved away from women's history topics at first, embracing the political economy of artisans and free labor for my dissertation, because I seemed to be getting this message that there was only room for one young Princeton scholar to work on Southern women's history. And her Plantation Mistress book had come out, and that seemed to underscore the point. So when I met Catherine about 5 years later in an SHA meeting, I was a little tiny bit disinclined to dislike her, or inclined to dislike her, or be envious of her. And instead I met this vibrant, funny, engaging, wonderful, accomplished young scholar, eager to support my efforts and to talk about her work and ideas. And we have been colleagues, co-editors, and especially dear friends ever since. I want to hasten to add that this circle of friendship, and my thanks, includes our other presenters as well. I've known Melissa Walker almost as long, not 52 years, almost as long as I've known Catherine, and we've both labored on behalf of the SAWH in a number of roles, and we both have shared in the special experience of teaching at a women's college, which in so many ways is a real privilege, and we have read and celebrated each other's work and championed each other's students and laughed together a lot along the way. Like Bill and Catherine, Melissa is a consummate historian, and I'm fortunate to count her among my dear friends too. And there is esteemed Yale historian Glenda Gilmore, whose brilliant work we also admire, and who I always feel especially connected to by virtue of her undergraduate career at my own institution, Wake Forest. I've always appreciated the way she has shared with me her affection and support for the teacher-scholar she studied with at Wake. And Glenda, you should know what an inspiration you continue to be to the undergraduate students there and to all our history faculty. And finally, while Charisse Jones and I do not know each other well, at least not yet, I see in Charisse welcome leadership from the next generation of scholars, the ones who are and will be leading the SAWH and the discipline forward. And I'm excited about what that means for all our futures. Just as I'm excited to and delighted really, to spend time and get to know better Pippa Holloway and Lisa Frank. They are both just wonderful scholars, wonderful people, and I know the future of the discipline is going to be just fine because of them as well. And Connie, you stole some words out of my mouth here. I really wanted to speak to what you have done for this organization, the SAWH, and women's historians and history and public history as a whole. It's really, really amazing. And I also had wanted to talk a little bit more about Betsy Jakeway and her amazing leadership. Betsy and Connie are just wonderful examples of scholars and leaders in the profession and in the SAWH. And they have shown so brightly throughout their careers. We all owe them our deepest gratitude. They are smart, courageous, kind, and tenacious. And they're really wonderful, wonderful people. And I hope all of you get to know them better over the course of the next day and a half. All right. In our post-Trump election, post-Kavanaugh appointment, post-daily mass shootings, post-Title IX assault, post-truth, maybe even post-history world, it seems naive to want Southern women's history in all its complexity to be more fully incorporated into American history. Yet I'm worried that the eye-opening, voluminous work on Civil War-era white and black Southern women across the last 50 years has become increasingly disposable in our current moment. Despite being heralded for its fertile interrogation of the sources and its analytical brio, this big body of scholarship is too often considered a subfield. the arguments in these often brilliant books are still not regularly and consistently reflected in the field as a whole, and certainly not in mainstream popular American histories that purport to cover the Confederacy and the Civil War. Thus, my title, Cultivating the Confederacy, is not meant simply to infer, in the most literal sense, white women's contributions to the South's failed political state, but the need for U.S. historians and producers of Civil War history more broadly to enrich, to improve upon and deepen U.S. history by more fully integrating Southern women's history into the narrative. In fact, I wonder if the next big challenge for the SAWH is not so much cultivating more great histories of Southern women and gender and sexuality, but ensuring that this scholarship receives a more central role, a less sidelined, a less othered role, not only in popular history, but in those places, academic departments, associations, journals, presses, conferences, foundations, prize committees, where formal Civil War history is debated and crafted. Set this growing body of work against the backdrop of more than 60,000 books attempting to capture the political thought, military design, and social turmoil of the Civil War. The most popular narrative that emerges from all of this general scholarship celebrates the Civil War for preserving the Union and thwarting America's racist past by ending slavery. Paul Escott has recently challenged that narrative, stating that our current politically and socially splintered world is a sharp reminder that we may be better served articulating the Civil War's failures over its successes. He argues that Civil War studies are at an inflection point and contends the field needs to generate fresher understandings by applying new methods of analysis and innovative approaches. Although Escott does not explicitly reference the value of more fully integrating women's history and gendered interpretation, the necessity to do so seems obvious. The Civil War freed 4 million enslaved men, women, and children, preserved the Union, and brought enormous changes to U.S. government and society. Over the course of the war, the South transformed itself into one enormous military and domestic battlefield. As many as 1 million Southerners fought for the Confederacy, over a quarter of whom died, along with 50,000 civilians. In this fractured society in constant motion, 500,000 slaves escaped to Union lines, Confederate families fled in advance of the Union Army, deserters returned to their kin, and guerrilla warfare reigned to the west. The impact of this wartime chaos on Southern white women would not be addressed by historians until more than 100 years after the Civil War itself, although it was documented in dozens and dozens of women's memoirs and letters. It would take Mary Elizabeth Massey to write, in the aftermath of the Civil War centennial, about wives fighting with their husbands over whether to stay in their homes, and refugee women struggling to support their families. Indeed, Massey's work was so formative that the Journal of the Civil War recently devoted a full issue to the current state of women's history in honor of the 50th anniversary of her Bonnet Brigade's American Women in the Civil War. As that journal issue demonstrated, with its probing essays by prominent women's historians on the era, Massey's work foreshadowed what would ultimately become an avalanche of new scholarship on women's wartime experience and agency. Over the last 50 years, we have learned much. The degree to which white women and children fended for themselves, becoming widows and orphans at alarming rates. How Confederate-ruled cities transmuted into menacing zones for women of all ages and social classes, challenged by inflation, desperate mobs, and starvation. And the cruel impact of marauding armies burning crops, homes, farms, churches, schools, when they did not appropriate them, putting women and children in physically dangerous and vulnerable straits. Women's lives were rocked by Union occupation with curfews, confiscation, and even exile, and cold-blooded guerrilla warfare brought a new kind of battlefield to their front doors. But through all these disasters, some women, Massey called them Southern women of invention, Drew Faust would call them mothers of invention, were finding new opportunities for themselves, whether by organizing food riots or entering new professions, striking for higher wages or running plantations and farms. In the wake of the new histories of slavery in the 1970s, scholars began to seek out enslaved and freed women's experiences too, and that body of scholarship has become an especially powerful force in the last 25 years. This new work showed how badly Black women and children suffered, separated from their families by fleeing planters and by army impressment, their bodies subject to more race violence and abuse than ever. This growing literature also demonstrated that even if enslaved women managed to escape to Union lines, they became contraband, treated like prisoners and exploited therein too. Uncertainty, scarcity, and want on top of brutality made the Civil War lives of African American women a living hell, although they also fought for and secured agency and opportunity and would grow their leadership throughout emancipation and Reconstruction. With the publication of field-defining works like the anthology Divided Houses, Gender in the Civil War in 1992, successive generations of women historians have depicted the varied ways in which women, whether enslaved, working class, or elite, fashioned new identities for themselves and launched telling political critiques across the wartime South. This work put women literally at the battle scene as nurses, spies, soldiers, prostitutes, laundresses, and refugees, even as it explored the ways women on the home front fought wars within their households to keep their social status, ideological beliefs, and soldier sons alive. This scholarship has demonstrated that Southern white women's nationalistic support of the Civil War shaped Union Army strategy from the beginning, substituting more often than not the home front for the battlefield in what is a powerful re-envisioning of how we locate the war and its impact. Union armies destroyed the households of their enemies in the Mississippi Valley, and Sherman evicted the women and children of Atlanta precisely because of the challenge they posed to Union success. Meanwhile, gendered understandings in the American South were radically altered by the acute crisis of experiencing the war and all its attendant consequences as Southern society reorganized in post-emancipation. Southern women, elite, poor, and enslaved, fought hard to construct and claim their citizenship. African American women fought hard for freedom and emancipation at the confluence of military action, policy making, and civil courts. All of this transformative work that has snowballed across the last 50 years should be remaking the way historians understand the Civil War, as well as the way the public perceives it, especially in the wake of the sesquicentennial. The question we need to ask is whether that has really been happening, and what still needs to be done to ensure that it does. This query is not meant to challenge the work of the SAWH, but instead to underline its importance. Although there have been multiple intellectual, social, and political wellsprings that help explain the outpouring of so much great Southern women's and gender history over the last 5 decades, the SAWH has been an especially mighty source for this work and an advocate for its integration into mainstream fields. Some 50 years ago, when I was a kid, and my dad was taking me to the public library in Milford, New Jersey to check out books, and he was feeding me popular Civil War historian Bruce Catton's books at that time, a handful of women historians who had been attending the SHA gathered in the basement of the Kentucky Hotel in Louisville next to the boiler room, always an important part, next to the boiler room. They met to form a caucus, intent on studying the status of women in the profession and encouraging women's history scholarship. Not coincidentally, they met the same year that Anne Ferrer Scott's landmark book, The Southern Lady from Pedestal to Politics, came out. I encountered Southern history and women's history, including Massey's and Scott's work, during my undergraduate years at Rice University, about a decade after the SAWH's founding. At Rice, I had the great fortune of working as the student assistant for the Journal of Southern History. It was in the journal office, more than in my classes, where I learned how history was made. And it was there that I learned how young women historians like Catherine Clinton, Suzanne Lebsock, Jacqueline Jones, and Thavolia Glimpf were beginning to reshape Southern history, largely based on the reports that the new JSH editor, John Bowles, was bringing back to the staff from the annual SHA meetings. Those real-time reports prompted me to take my first U.S. women's history courses offered at Rice during my senior year, and with John Bowles' support, convinced me to go to graduate school. When I arrived at Princeton, Natalie Davis had a coterie of grad students working on sophisticated studies of European women's history. Joan Scott was about to deliver her groundbreaking essay on gender and the politics of history at the Institute for Advanced Studies. I prepared a U.S. women's history field for my exams with Christine Stanzel that began with Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's work and ended with Sarah Evans' personal politics. But I had to take her undergraduate course because no grad course existed in U.S. women's history, let alone in gender or sexuality in the history department, nor were U.S. women's or gender history especially integrated into U.S. history grad courses at that time. I did not encounter the SAWH, which by then was a growing organization of several hundred members, until I moved to Georgia to research my dissertation. I quickly found a community of like-minded scholars there. Faculty at the University of Georgia and Emory University, especially Jean Friedman and Betsy Fox Genovese, invited me to share my work and engage with their grad students. They urged me to attend the SHA, and it was in an SHA meeting in Birmingham that Jean invited me to lunch and asked Catherine Clinton to join us. The two of them quickly persuaded me that joining the SAWH was the single most important act a young scholar could take. Connie just told us that. And at least in my case, and in Connie's, I think they were right. My community of women's historians expanded greatly as I began attending the annual SAWH addresses, receptions, and panels, and Connie referenced the first SAWH conference at Converse. What distinguished SAWH events, formal and informal, from my experience with the OHA and the AHA was their warm commitment to welcoming everyone, to supporting historians at all stages of their careers, from grad school to retirement, and from all schools, from community colleges to the Ivy Leagues. While these meetings did not reflect attendance that was particularly racially or ethnically diverse early in my experience, the need to do better on this front, the need to be more inclusive, was always a central conversation and voiced long before other organizations did so, at least in my memory. The SAWH was also the first place in the profession where I heard about issues like sexual harassment and gender discrimination, and we discussed these seriously. I should also add it was the first and last conference I ever brought an infant child to. Well, I knew that all my colleagues, including my male ones, would empathize with my predicament as a brand new working mom in fulfilling my committee expectations by attending. I quickly discovered, as Virginia Woolf articulated long ago, that women's experiences are too often bodied ones. In this case, this nursing mother's bodied experience, coupled with an unusually unhappy wailing baby, kept me sidelined despite all my best efforts. Working parent challenges aside, although they should never be ignored, the SAWH created a professional space in which scholars of Southern women's history and gender could name, share, and legitimate the challenges they were often facing as historians, including condescension about their subject choice and its intellectual merits, and skepticism about the availability of suitable archival resources, which Catherine talked so brilliantly about last afternoon. It was at SAWH events, from public panel discussions to private late-night conversations, where we could voice our frustration at the absence of women's, and especially African-American women's, voices, actions, and lived experiences in the Southern past, but also in our own present. This set of sensibilities holds true right up to the SAWH's present. For me, the SAWH has been a place that legitimized my desire to find agency in that half of the population that had been hidden from history for over 2,000 years. It also, and just as importantly, maybe even more so in some respects, gave me agency as a professional historian. Supporting the SAWH through committee work and leadership positions helped me understand in real time, not just as a historian, how institutions can be tools of change and growth. My SAWH work probably also helps explain my willingness to do administrative work at this stage of my career. While I still have some ambivalence about this role, I assume I have to be making a difference simply by being one of only 2 women on our university's 12-member administrative cabinet and appointing so many women as departmental chairs. If there is one singular thread we can point to across the SAWH's 50 years, for the focus and the methods and the theories underpinning Southern women's history have changed dramatically. It is the organization's insistence on women's equity in the profession. From policies to annual addresses to conference keynotes, grad student workshops, and roundtables, from the 1970s right down to the present, the SAWH has called for more gender equity and has encouraged women to go willingly into traditional male preserves of power by being department chairs and deans. The challenge remains, unfortunately. A recent study documented that while 52% of lecturers in higher ed are women, only 24% are full professors, 14% department chairs, and 12% deans. It should be no surprise that the numbers of women of color in these more senior posts fall well below these already modest figures. While the SAWH has staunchly championed women's professional status, and many of its members have gone on to lead other organizations like the SHA and the OAH, to lead departments and colleges, and even Harvard University, and now to lead the movement of the Cassandra Project, the organization has also been a forceful advocate for important new scholarship. By the 1990s, SAWH officers and keynote speakers and the membership itself were publishing field-changing books and articles. The triennial conference had quickly moved into the go-to event for younger scholars eager to get feedback from the top scholars in the field. The University Press of Missouri partnered with the SAWH to publish a series on Southern women's history based on the best SAW conference papers. The series is now up to 9 volumes, by the way. And the SAWH Book and Article Prizes garnered serious attention, too. And just in the last decade, the University of Georgia Press has published a new state-by-state series of rich biographical essays about significant women within these states. The series currently covers 10 states for a total of 19 volumes, all edited by SAWH members, and virtually all the essay authors are SAWH members too. All told, the SAWH has become a key intellectual locus where bold new work that challenges once rigid presumptions about the limits of source material has recovered the ways women across race, class, and place have made their mark on the Southern past, including across slavery, war, and defeat. Although only 5 of the 39 SAWH annual addresses delivered at the SHA since 1979 have covered the Civil War era, which I think is interesting that it's just 5, each of these speakers has subsequently published one or more field-defining award-winning books. Catherine Clinton delivered Sex and the Sectional Conflict in 1990, Thavolia Glimpf, Civil War Memoirs and the Reinvention of Black Women's History in 1993, Stephanie McCurry, The Brothers' War, Free Women, Slaves, and Popular Politics in the Civil War South in 1999, Jacqueline Jones, Nancy Johnson's Story, Rethinking the History of Women in the South During the Civil War and Reconstruction in 2005, and Crystal Feimster, Indecent and Obscene, White Officers, Black Women, and Rape in the Contraband Quarters of the American Civil War in 2012. The 10th SAWH conference held in Charleston in 2015 sponsored a big war roundtable, The Civil War as a Household War, with its discussants including Leanne Weitz, Lisa Frank, and Margaret Story. The 11th SAWH conference, just held this past June in Tuscaloosa, sponsored some half-dozen papers on Civil War women's and gender history and included a roundtable titled Defining the Field of Battle, Gender in the Civil War, with Leanne Weitz and Lisa again, and also Barbara Gannon, Judith Giesberg, and Amy Taylor, all of whose work has changed how scholars understand the battlefront. Given the predominance of this work in Southern and U.S. history, there are times when I look at popular depictions of the Civil War and I get a little crazed. Simply Google the Wikipedia Civil War entry or pull up the Civil War themed commentary and archive stories in the New York Times, and you could conclude that half the population of the South never existed. In her smart book of essays titled Dead Girls, Alison Boland observes all the ways media and print culture have used America's obsession with abused, tortured, maimed, and murdered young women in their bodies as backdrops for telling men's stories since the mid-20th century, from Raymond Chandler's film noir to the endless supply of Law and Order episodes. I am being flip and tasteless, and it's probably really inappropriate here, but I would almost prefer that contemporary popular depictions of the Civil War at least begin their narratives with the dead girls motif, rather than leave women out altogether, as they do again and again. Contemporary American media still prefers narratives about fallen soldiers and battles lost, omitting the stories historians have been recovering about women and children who suffered the loss of loved ones and were in essence sentenced to life with their sadness. If Jim McPherson is right in calling the American Civil War the central event in America's historical consciousness, could media acknowledgement of the Civil War as a history of assault and trauma for the civilians who fought multiple wars at home, across gender, race, and class, generate new empathy and invite new questions about inequity, suffering, and pain in the past and in our present world? Judith Giesberg has recently suggested that the work of historians like Lisa Frank, Stephanie McCurry, and Gregory Downs, all of which sheds powerful new light on the experiences of wartime women on the home front as its own battlefield, may have gone too far by privileging civilians over soldiers. But I would argue that until the American public grasps this conception of civilian suffering and resistance, we haven't gone far enough. In fact, in our own historical moment, where political polarization, violence, racism, and economic disparity predominate, we might want to dig even deeper into civilians' emotional lives, including the psychological impact of the traumas they faced, as in the work that scholars like Diane Somerville are doing by addressing rape and suicide, and to dig even deeper into the multiple forms of resistance civilians evinced, as in the work of Alicia Hines, a recent Duke PhD, who is showing how enslaved women use the Mississippi River as a series of liberating spaces for their empowerment. So how are we going to make sure that this exciting work is more fully integrated into Civil War history? And I mean the history that historians write and the history that popular media distributes. To historians, I have to ask, why must the Journal of Civil War History still do a themed issue on women's history? Why do too few articles in each regular issue integrate gendered analysis? Why can't the editors and reviewers use the peer review process to insist submitted articles do just that? I recently served on a prize committee for a Best Journal article. We read and then discussed the merits of some 2.5 dozen essays on Southern history published over the previous 2 years. One of the essays situated itself in the Civil War era South, and it was smart, original, well-argued, well-written. In fact, it was one of the top 3 essays in each of the committee members' lists. But in the end, we agreed not to award the prize to this essay. While it was very good, it reflected no women's or gendered historiography or interpretation whatsoever, treating the enslaved people it was discussing as undifferentiated by sex or gender. It was as if the 50 years of scholarship we have been talking about here did not exist. You might argue that we were being unfair, choosing to eliminate the essay because of what it did not do, rather than what it did and did well. But here's the rub, and here's where we as historians have to be more scrupulous and be more demanding. The essay essentially ignored the unique experiences of half of its subjects, and it ignored a rich scholarship that would have profoundly deepened the author's analysis and conclusions. Over 20 years ago, Glenda Gilmore in her SAWH address critiqued the walling off of scholarship into disciplinary subfields, describing this inclination as the balkanization of history. For Gilmore, and I think for all of us, analyses that separate these subfields misrepresent the way people actually live their lives. Until we hold our colleagues accountable for their tendency to balkanize women's and gender history, then we're not being good historians. If we in the profession had been fair to the author whose otherwise good essay ignored gender, the author would have received that critique during the peer review process. So we have to ask ourselves why that did not happen and figure out how to make it happen more. What else can we be doing? In her chapter on the Civil War in her new single-volume U.S. History, These Truths, Jill Lepore does something pretty path-breaking. She actually gives Southern women the agency Southern women's historians have long been documenting. She describes the impact of the Confederate draft on Southern families. She shows how Southern women dealt with deprivation. She points out the irony of Southern war rhetoric urging soldiers to fight to protect their wives against the backdrop of women's political protests against conscription and hunger. She underlines the fact that their wartime disfranchisement compelled Confederate white women to claim their citizenship. Lepore insists, and she can do so because she is standing atop a powerful body of scholarship across the last 50 years, that the origin of America's modern welfare state lies in Southern white women's protests during the Confederacy. Oh, irony of ironies. Reading Lepore's chapter and thinking about the significance of that argument for our field in the first one-volume U.S. history textbook authored by a woman prompts me to share a final hope for the future of Civil War scholarship. 30 years ago, my thesis advisor, James McPherson, published Battle Cry of Freedom, the one-volume narrative history of the Civil War that would earn him a Pulitzer Prize. At the time, reviewers raved about the book's well-written integration of political, social, and military events, from the war with Mexico through Appomattox, as well as its insistence on slavery as the underlying cause of the war. They celebrated the book's portrait of emancipation, this new birth of freedom, as Lincoln called it, as the most important legacy of America's ghastliest war. I want you to imagine with me what a new Pulitzer Prize-winning one-volume narrative of the Civil War would look like, one that truly integrated political, military, social, and gendered scholarship. It would be a revisionist work that fully embraces the splendid scholarship of the last 5 decades in women's history and histories of gender and sexuality. It would claim new intellectual territory and would have big repercussions for how we help the public interpret the Civil War. I think the public may be hungrier for this work than we realize. In the wake of the sesquicentennial, attendance at Civil War sites was pretty uneven and not especially impressive. Unfortunately, some experts have surmised, this was because many sites made slavery, as they should have, and the experience of the enslaved more central to their interpretation. But they did this at a time when we as a society have become divided on the depths of contemporary racism as slavery's legacy. But experts have not commented on a surprising set of high visitor numbers. The Clara Barton National Historic Site and the Women's Rights National Historical Park experienced dramatic increases, and in fact were actually among the top 5 most heavily visited sites, not the traditional battlefields, during the sesquicentennial. Public historians recognize this hunger for more women's and gendered history, and they are bringing more gendered programming to their sites, as the Richmond National Battlefield Park is. We as scholars can support their efforts by writing Civil War histories that eschew balkanization and more fully capture all Southerners' experiences. As historians, we are always rolling up our sleeves and looking for unfinished business. We must embrace our expertise, we must balance our embrace of our expertise with a willingness to question our authoritative voice and recognize its limitations. Just as Gary Gallagher, Barton Myers, and other Civil War historians have argued that we must expunge the mental barriers that separate military history from political and social developments, we must likewise expunge the mental barriers that separate military, political, and social history from gender developments. It's in that light that I offer suggestions for the kind of work I would like to see in that single-volume Civil War history. I do applaud the recent path-breaking big histories that transformed the benign stories of American capitalism's triumph into a much truer depiction of national dependence on enslaved bodies to make great wealth. In these important histories, the Civil War becomes a clash of market-owning titans in the North and South, not a morality fight over slavery. As learned and persuasive as these big histories are, as humane as they seek to be, their inattentiveness to the forces of gender seems striking and begs much more focus. And what about more work on the nature of nationalism in the South on the eve of the Civil War that teases out differences across the region between wealthy slaveholders and non-slaveholders, sure, and between intellectual leaders, but to include women? We have so much more work available to us in this area. What forces were shaping the meaning that Southerners made out of the concept of nation, and how were they gendered? We have tended to study women's pro-slavery rhetoric in isolation as an entity unto itself. But what happens when we look for new patterns of thought across that divide? Does the evolution of Southern nationalism begin to look any differently? And what about Southern religion? How did religious leaders respond to home front circumstances that fundamentally challenged the very racial and gendered hierarchies ministers had long sought to preserve? How were women making sense of their wartime religious experiences? And what about the Black church and women's leadership therein? Elsa Barkley Brown, Evelyn Higginbotham, and others have begun these important inquiries, but can we explore them in more detail and even link them to other forms of Black women's wartime resistance? Similarly, scholars since Stephen Channing have long documented the crisis of white fear that prevailed across secession and the Civil War. We know from Stephen Hahn and others that slaves were well aware of the developing sexual conflict and used that knowledge to generate new means of opposition. To what extent were these information networks of gossip and rumor gendered? And where did those pieces of shared knowledge across the race line mostly occur? Now that we have a large number of studies of Black women during the Civil War, we need to convey more fully how their political ideas shape social and political realities and responses and reactions across the Confederacy. As Laura Edwards and others have argued, internal turmoil profoundly weakened the Confederacy, but we still do not know all that much about the women who supported deserters and guerrilla activities, or the women who rioted and mobbed in the fight to feed their families. How did women actually navigate a disparate world in chaos where men had long held mastery? What happened to their mentalities and newfound tools with emancipation? We know that the Civil War devastated the physical environment. Its terrible impact ruined crops and destroyed livestock, unleashed diseases, created food deserts, and spoiled water sources. In short, wartime changed entire ecosystems. I have not yet read Joan Cashin's new book, but I am hopeful it explores the ways wartime attitudes about nature, progress, and the environment were gendered, how social and legal systems of power responded to these new material realities, and how they played out across place, race, and class. And I hope we see more of this scholarship here. We also know that many of our comfortable categorizations do not really hold up that well these days. So much recent work challenges our once comfortable geographic categorizations of the war. The boundary between North and South has gotten increasingly blurry. Consider gendered experiences in Civil War Washington, D.C., for example, where freed women negotiated with federal agencies to find their children and legitimize their marriages. The South as category itself is problematic when you think about women in the Missouri borderlands, where no real separation from war front and home front existed, or white and Black women's experiences in Sherman's Path in Georgia, or their encounters in Union-occupied Mississippi. I think you can tell I'm really excited by this idea of a new one-volume Civil War history that embraces these conceptualizations and reaches historians and popular audience alike. It would be terrific if one of you in the audience, maybe Lisa Frank for sure, would write such a book, and I would love it to get the Pulitzer Prize. I want to close by stating that I offer this talk ultimately out of gratitude. I have been well supported, well mentored, and well served by a close-knit community of Southern historians, men and women alike, some in and some not in the SAWH. It is a privilege to me to be asked to speak from that experience, to offer up a reflection as a woman of a certain age about the changing dynamics of our field and about the profession itself, and especially as a beneficiary of nearly 50 years of the SAWH's shining efforts on both these critical fronts. Thank you. Questions? Yes. Catherine.
Well, I'll start off and ask, someone who's been a witness to this change, and, I'm, I think, too, in the weeds on this or in the trenches simultaneously. But it occurs to me when you make the claim that, one has to hold fields accountable, that I've witnessed more change, more integration, that articles that come into the journals, for example, looking at the Civil War and not dealing with race would just be thrown out. There would be absolutely no question. And the integration of, race and sex into the narrative is what people are working on. But after 50 years, I can look and say, well, it's worked so effectively on race, although representation doesn't work so well, because if you look at the numbers in the academy and the numbers of people trying to make those changes, you're at a disadvantage in terms of those scholars who are working from personal experience rather than in the field. But there has been a collaboration, a really strong one, I think, between scholars of race history and scholars who are themselves minorities working through the system. So I'm trying to figure out how, at this late stage, to make that change and difference within gender. Maybe, I suggested many years ago that we needed to just be ugly. I remember that. And then having very concerned women scholars come up to me and tell me we shouldn't talk that way because just be ugly has sexual connotations. It was so interesting to me. Then I went back and did something on public women, because in the 19th century, any women who were in the public were called public women, and they were then suspected to be prostitutes. So it seems as if, in the field of gender advancement, women continue to be timid because of these kinds of issues. I'm sort of hoping in an age of Me Too, in an age of, growing polarization but recognition of the issue of gender and women being so linked. That is, that the exploitation of people who are vulnerable, whether men or women, based upon a power relationship which is sexualized, is where we may have to need to come, because maybe that happened in the 70s or 80s, indeed, in terms of racial exploitation, racial ideas. But it comes up again and again, of course, in the context of representation and Civil War history. But when do you think, or do you think, there might be a change so that people are willing to make the kind of demands that change the narrative?
Well, I think it's happening. I think about those roundtables. I wasn't at the roundtables. Yeah, Lisa, do you want to speak to that?
I would say that even when the women are making those demands, or any scholars who write about women are trying to include them in Civil War history, there is a very large group of usually men who actually think that it doesn't matter. So it's okay to write about women if they're nurses. It's okay to write about women who are doing womanly things during the Civil War. But if you try to take them and say, look, they're part of the narrative of the battles, they're part of the strategy, they're part of the military history, and you need to include it, they kind of roll their eyes at you, or they say something really unpleasant about how this doesn't matter. And so they dismiss it. Look at all the prizes for the SCWH. They're almost always men.
I almost put
and
that
if you
in there,
look in their indexes, which I always do, maybe there are 3 pages on women. But they sometimes cite the books they're supposed to cite, but it doesn't match up to the paragraph. So they're not actually incorporating it, even though those of us who are writing it are demanding it. They just ignore it. So I'm not really sure what the solution is. I don't think I'm
Well,
qualified.
I know they're being taught not to include it.
Right.
Right. Just as, the unspoken problem that I see being on search committees and serving on a lot of committees, that during a certain period of the past 50 years, women scholars trying to rise within the academy found if they were not women's historians, they might be women, but they would not only try to minimize that by becoming honorary males and serving to be critics of women's history or feminist interpretations, and I can be very explicit, I choose not to. But there is, that kind of phenomenon that goes on, so that you then have representations of women doing work. And it's so funny, because I often end up on panels with them, and they come to say, they put me on this panel on women, I don't do women, and why would they do that? And I said, well, you have breasts and a vagina, and therefore you become an expert on something. It's really, a phenomenon that is often not spoken about, but that equally, I think, causes a problem. Now, though, those women, I think, do get a lot of gender consciousness when they hit a certain ceiling or level and recognize the way in which tokenism has not worked to benefit them. I mean, I was recently asked to be on a panel of all women for a Civil War symposium, and I was quite thrilled until they titled it First Ladies of the Civil War. But at the same time, rather than protest it or demand one of my wonderful feminist Civil War scholars that I can count on one hand, males, be on the panel, we were looking at the fact that that very same week at Stanford, a conference was called to do History and Policy by Niall Ferguson, that I think included one woman chair of the many scholars. So, we are often put in positions where we are, quote, whining, quote, demanding, and I'm just wondering, when the whines and demands are going to become powerful. And administrators can make that call. In the UK now, they're saying if you have a panel that's funded by the government, a conference being funded, you must show equity. That's coming out of the European Union. I don't know if it'll fall apart following Brexit, but Glenda, give us some insight.
So, I'm teaching the Civil War era for the first time in 20 years in Ireland, WCD Dublin. And a couple of things. Ireland its Parliament just approved a law that 40% of positions, 40% of faculty at universities in Ireland have to be women. And that until they reach that, they're setting aside positions controlled by the governing council of universities only for women. And if they want to get out of that, then they can hire more women in the regular jobs, and we'll reassess in 2022. Teaching the Civil War in Ireland has been a completely different experience from what it might be here, because there's never the states' rights kid. There's never, they're horrified. They're so horrified that holding up a mirror to us is amazing. But one of the things it made me realize is there is a bias in our profession against hiring women to teach the Civil War because they're afraid they're not going to do the battles or because they're not men. And I think that has a lot, it's implicated with the refusal to listen to women who are writing about the Civil War, listening to gender about the Civil War. And the last thing that I have to throw out there, this is more of a comment than a question. So, as they say in the annals, I've read most of Crystal Feaster's new book about rape in the Civil War, and the opposition that she met when she first started that book, that the Civil War was a war against women, that it was a war in which rape occurred, which was especially a low rape war, was phenomenal. It was personally expressed, it was professionally expressed. She was almost blocked from reading papers. And she's thoroughly convinced me that the peril to women, particularly in the area that she's working in Mississippi, particularly of Black women, was immediate, horrific, and made a huge difference in the way that the war played out, particularly in gradually occupied areas. So, I would ask you, because every 3 minutes, as a dean, as a former student of David Smiley, we had one Civil War professor at Wake Forest, and he taught the Old South. How do
I know what you're going to ask me, and I have an answer.
how do universities
Yeah, yeah.
allocate
positions in the Civil War. I think that's
Yep.
a big part
Yep.
of what we're talking
Yep.
about as a problem.
Yep.
You did it, and yours personally, but I don't think your experience is a common one.
I think you're probably right. And I mean, at Wake Forest, well, we all know, and we'll talk about this probably more at lunchtime, that history departments are experiencing, with the exception of Yale, a deep drop in history majors. And we had a Civil War historian at Wake Forest, Paul Escott, for many, many years, very distinguished Civil War historian. And we have a department of 20 historians, and don't repeat these numbers outside this room, but 30 majors, 20 historians and 30 majors. And we don't have a master's program, we don't have a PhD program. And then I'm the dean. So then I'm suddenly the dean, and this is my department, it's my colleagues, it's Civil War. And I'm in this position. Do I even fill this position, given all the demands we have in other departments where we have a lot more? But I think we have to do something. We have to do something that's important and big, and we can't not cover the Civil War at a history department that has had the kind of reputation for doing Southern history since David Smiley for a long, long time. And I kind of made a quiet little deal with my new chair, a woman, a very talented, a very talented historian and savvy woman. And I said, I will give you this line for Civil War, if you promise me that you get a woman or woman of color for this position. And you have to promise me, and I can't, like legally we can't do that. But, and we had, and but the bottom line was that we have the best, I think we have the best young scholar in the country, one of the best young scholars in the country who does Civil War era history, who just happens to also be a woman of color. And so and we will do everything institutionally to support her and make her successful. But I think deans have to do those kinds of things, right? They have to do those kinds of things in those kinds of fields. And you have to have department chairs who are willing to make that happen and to recognize that the institutional change is the only way we're going to make those kinds of differences. So that's, I mean, departments have to do that. Search committees have to be willing to do that. You have to create resources to make that happen, and you also have to make resources to be able to support the people that you bring in. Does that get at your question? I mean, what we...
It's legal to have target of opportunity hires. They go on all the time. At every university, we see them happen. You know, I'm really asking this question.
No. I mean, we did this. We wrote this into the Mellon, when we did a Mellon grant, and we wrote in an interdisciplinary humanities position, and I wrote in explicitly that we wanted it for target of opportunity. The Mellon Foundation people made me take it out, and I had to talk to their lawyers.
Interesting. Well, I'm just trying to say, you know, back to this idea, Glenda, that you know, we do have target of opportunity in the Civil War, which continues, despite the decreasing numbers, to be a big ticket course on many campuses, particularly in the South. You know, making it a priority to do that change. And I would like to say that when I was teaching at Harvard in the early 80s, I proposed a topic for an NEH bid. It was called Dishonor Infinitely Worse Than Death, Rape in the Civil War. And a very distinguished scholar of Civil War history, who was a great mentor to me, refused to write a letter for it. Henry Louis Gates did write a letter for it. Several other scholars discouraged me from this project. I went to the papers of Jefferson Davis to look at the quotes about it, to try and work on it. It was so discouraged, and I can say, you know, with my first book, A White Woman at Harvard, trying to do this topic, to be so discouraged was discouraging. I now have had students working on it, and especially in the wake of Crystal's finding material and bringing it to the fore. But it is kind of a triple whammy. As you know, Diane Somerville's early work on rape found that I would talk to scholars and say, I can't understand why this brilliant young person with this wonderful topic, you know, is having such trouble. And I was told specifically by champions of Diane's that many of the male faculty felt uncomfortable during her job talk, and that created a problem. And we are talking about the way in which, therefore, we maybe have a sensorial, we send students in one direction, not another. We ask them to be more safe, you know, I remember telling a student, include some men, make it, you know, less sensational for your job talk, you know, because we do have to appeal that way. But when, you know, I feel like, you know, when is it not appropriate to actually talk directly about these subjects in an important way, especially considering the era, especially we're on campuses where the rape crisis is increasing, especially under the direction of the current Secretary of Education. You know, we're, you know, so if we don't do it historically and make a voice, some of us who are protected, I think, have it easier, but I'm thinking about graduate students and tenured faculty looking at that issue. If anyone has stories they want to share.
This is a little question of how do you get other people to legitimize it, right?
Exactly.
Because I mean, I submitted a book manuscript and I said, well, you know, I like that last chapter about men. You should really focus the whole book on that. That was my epilogue. It was like half of the chapter. That wasn't what the point of the book was. That was to show how gender affected everyone. But the press said, oh, well, you should really do that. And I said, no, I took it somewhere else. But you have to find the reviewers who are willing to take what's there and say, oh, that's looking at it in a new way, or that's an important aspect of it. And I think, I mean, I don't know other fields as well, but Civil War, I feel like it's like a constant wall that we're banging against.
And I think it's a deliberate.
Yeah.
Well, I'm absolutely sure that people protected it topically as sacrosanct.
Yes.
They had so much invested in
They
so
feel
much
like they
of
own
their careers invested that they want to keep it. And I don't usually say those things.
Glenda and all of the rest of you who are speaking on this, but clearly it's a problem not just in the Civil War, it's a problem in the Revolutionary War, it's a problem in the study of the war in Vietnam.
It is a war, yeah.
The celebration of World War I had almost nothing about the domestic participation of women and the military participation of women. The Great Generation is all male. The greatest generation of World War II is all male. And I think that it is particularly visible because the Civil War is such an iconic event. And I see this. I live in South Carolina, but I have strong academic ties with British historians. And most of the young people who are doing the study of American history in Britain, they're either studying slavery or they're studying the Civil War. And civil rights, slavery, civil rights, and the Civil War. And so it's that, but it is across the board. And so, yes, there should be a one-volume history of the Civil War that incorporates the scholarship on women, but there should also be better one-volume surveys of American history that incorporate women's experiences in these key events. I'm curious whether any of the undergraduates
I know, I wonder what the students are thinking. Yeah.
have any comment either on the paper or on this impassioned discussion amongst us who are doing it, whether this matters to anyone.
I went to an all-girls school for high school, and basically they kind of taught us the same thing, like, oh, you should try to speak your voice out, and although you're among men, like, our brother's school, we would always make fun of them because none of them were smart. Like, you know, it was an all-boys school, and they only cared about football, and they only cared about basketball and sports, and nothing really academic-wise, and that's one thing that I think was one of the blessings that I had with that school, was that we were basically forced to focus in class. We weren't allowed to, and although there's a lot of debate as to why same-sex education isn't, you know, appropriate for girls or isn't appropriate for boys, just because of the fact that, you know, you should be able to feel equal among your counterparts. But the problem is that, I don't know, I feel like a lot of people take for granted same-sex education, and that was one thing that I really liked about it, was that we could be able to talk about history without being told, oh, you know, that's wrong. Like, or, oh, but this is the way that I think about it, and the way that I think about it is better the way that you think about it because I'm a guy, you know? And it's like, a lot of times you just feel like very empowered amongst like your, you know, the people that are around you. And I like the way that you like thanked all your, the people that in the beginning, and like you spoke about all the other like authors and stuff, but I don't know, it's just whenever I think about like women empowerment, I always think about my high school just because it was very empowering, and I feel like now I'm able to like come to events like these and be able to speak out when like before I used to just like sit down and stay quiet and, you know, never say anything. But
In your classes, do you take history classes other than this very fine undertaking? And do you find the discussion is gendered in the sense that they have done studies saying that males speak more and longer and females are less likely?
Yeah.
Is that true?
And
Does it vary depending upon whether the professor is male or female?
I think it's usually more so with female professors, because at least for high school, I had this wonderful professor, Dr. Clifford. She was, she basically lived through everything. She's one of like my favorite, and like will always be my favorite history professor. And she always says,
unless you go to some of these fine graduates.
yes.
All right.
And she always says the same thing, you know, that when she was in grad school, when she was in doing her PhD, she said that she always had a very hard time to be able to even look at people and to talk to them without being turned down, or, you know, without being told that there was a problem in the way that she spoke, and, you know, that she should speak more feminine. And, you know, there's no problem with being feminine, because I am feminine, but I also am smart. You know, I'm more than just feminine. And I feel like that's like one of the biggest problems that women are still facing today, is that we're still being classified as feminine, but nothing else.
So I really appreciate your sharing that experience with us and your thoughts about it. I was thinking to myself, I also went to a girls' high school for 3 years, and I know coming from just a regular co-ed public school environment and then being put into, for my sophomore, junior, and senior year, a girls' high school, I suddenly saw things in a new way, right? There were whole new dynamics that I hadn't paid attention to. And I think when I talked to Melissa, and I have shared about what it means to teach at a women's college and what that feels like and how that works, it creates a very positive, I think, way of navigating the world and talking, being present and talking in conversations and not really thinking about the unspoken rules about who gets to talk and who has power in the room. And so I think women's education creates just a encouraging way to take on the world in a way that, for your professor or your teacher in high school who's experienced negative consequences, that's another side of it. It's much harsher, I think, to experience how your voice is shut out in a conversation, to experience those dynamics. That is always my argument for why there's important value in women's education, girls' education today, because it ultimately is empowering. You feel what it feels like to be in a women's community. The SAWH, though it has wonderful men who support it and who are in it, I would never say otherwise, it has been a different kind of community that's been very nurturing and supportive of other scholars, and especially of women scholars. And you know, the goal, I think, is that we create those kinds of communities in all our classrooms and wherever we are, and in our political and organizations and everything that we do.
And especially, I mean, for me at least, like I'm Hispanic, which is even more so of you know, you shouldn't be saying that, you should stay quiet. You know, there's a saying, calladita te ves más bonita, which is basically, when you're quiet, you look prettier. You know, and it's like, my family used to always say that to me because I used to always speak. I used to always just talk and say whatever was on my mind. And that was something that, like, at least for Hispanics, you know, you're not really supposed to do per se, but I don't know, I just like being in that environment and being able to be in that high school, I was able to do so much. And I think even here I can come and like, you know, talk about my experiences or talk about, you know, my opinions, without like feeling, you know, not neglected, but more of without feeling like turned out. And you know,
see, we come here to learn from you, because 50% of my students are Latinos. So now I know to make t-shirts and a little adjustment to that slogan for them, because it's very hard to get them to speak, and they say, my brother is the one who's the historian. I'm saying, no, you would be the one to get your PhD. So it's really exciting to hear that this comes. But also, I think the women's movement now, in the 21st century, at least in the Me Too movement, we have to move toward being more humanitarian. You know, working on Harriet Tubman taught me humanitarianism is equally important, so that, yes, it's good to have these women's environments, but certainly the LGBT community and others have taught us much about the politics of exclusion that deal as well with
I feel like
issues.
also one big problem is that women sometimes clash, and although we're like, oh, women, you know, we should support each other, we should empower each other, a lot of times it's like, oh, did you see what she was wearing? Or, oh, did you see her hair? Like, did you see her makeup? You know, and as much as you don't want to do that, and as much as it still ends up happening. And because of that,
yes, age.
Well, we didn't have social media to the point. I really do think social media has changed identity issues. That's what we're being told.
You need to be perfect all the time. You need to constantly have your face. You can't have acne. You know, as soon as proactive commercials came out, everybody was suddenly concerned with acne. And women became more concerned with acne because commercials started to be targeted towards women.
And the best is adult acne commercials.
Yeah.
They're like, don't be imperfect.
The
50 years later.
The girl, and she's like putting on a different face mask, and it's just a girl. You know, I get what they're trying to do because it's capitalism. You know, America feeds off of capitalism. But at the same time, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to acknowledge, and there's a lot of things that we need to change, I guess.
Thank you.
So are you Florida women, Southern women in this class? Do you feel Southern? Do you feel like you're Southern women? No. No, you're not Southern. So you don't have any identity as being Southern. I'm just asking.
I mean, I'm not like,
But you're not Southern from
I mean, I'm not like, I think there's a difference between from Atlanta and from like Georgia.
Okay.
It's very set in Georgia, and you're like,
So do you think if someone asks you, and you say you're from Atlanta, that that's a distinctive difference from saying I'm from Georgia?
yeah, but one thing that I know, Southern values and like, I was around like a lot, okay, my next door neighbors growing up, they were Southern Baptists. And like my family was Catholic, and like Catholic is much, it's not a very Southern type value religion, I guess I'd say. And so I remember people next door, they were like, it was like almost like a culture shock growing up maybe, because it was more towards middle school they moved in, so it was like, wow, there's some difference. And when the girls were there, it was like, they were the homemakers, and like the boys would like do the masculine work, and like drinking was just unacceptable, especially for a woman. my was like Catholic. Yeah, it was. I understand. Like, I was around like Southern women, and I definitely was not identified as that.
Maybe we have a
Yeah. Like, I'm obviously from Florida, but I'm from Miami, so I never really categorized myself as Southern just because Miami's filled with Hispanics. Like, my mother's Hispanic and my dad's full-on American. So, I don't know. Same thing. Like, I grew up Catholic, so I feel like my aunt lives in Georgia, like, Southern. Like, all her neighbors are like her friend actually lives in the Civil War house that was a hospital, so it's like a national, like, monument that they can never tear down. So it's like interesting to go to Georgia and see like how southern it is there, and then like I just feel like their southern values are very different from like Miami in general, just because people are from everywhere. It's not really southern, even though it's in Florida. So
It's the way these assumptions, especially even studying the Civil War, if you're studying it, you're saying you're Catholic, you're saying your dad's full-on American versus your mother. We use these language differences. I know Glenda knows from teaching in Ireland. I taught a freshman seminar on the American Civil War, and I told them they could ask me anything in the third week, a very tentative student raised a hand and said, I'm doing all the reading, Professor Clinton, but I just don't understand. You have Confederates, you have the Union, so which side were the Catholics on? And they never believed me after I said both. You know, that was a real problem. So, in other words, we cling to our identities. And, you know, I would say that being the Southern Association of Core Women Historians and being in the Southern history, we have this problem that people make assumptions about it. But I sort of argue that, you know, we were ahead of the game in looking at African American and slavery at the center. We had people who thought slavery wasn't at the center in our organization, and that became the biggest fight. And people who weren't even thinking about it got involved with it and thought about making new ideas about the Civil War. And that there were Hispanics fighting in the Civil War. There were, you know, women disguising themselves as men who were born in Cuba, raised, you know, we try and be more inclusive, and I think it's incumbent. So I would like to see Southern become this very positive enhancement that's not narrowed by, you know, making assumptions. But all of you can do that in your work.
I think it's culture-based racism, but there's a way for sure. I love the South, that was great, but I'm not like, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't think there's ever around enough people. I think that is almost dying out. I think there's people in like the middle of nowhere, and you go say all good schools or something like that. And maybe they still hold on to those. I wouldn't even call them values really, but I just.
So you see the core of Southern values maybe as being racism and sexism?
I know there's more. I don't want to say that.
No, but I'm saying there's lots of things
I didn't say that.
No, you don't. There's lots of things that are Southern, and what we're trying to say is, can we readjust what
I think
being
if
Southern
you let
is?
go of the racism, sexism of Southern, like, Southern values, I think that, yeah, the South have better, more positive. I think it could turn into a more positive culture.
Okay.
I mean, I'm from Pennsylvania, so like when I decided to come to school here, a lot of people were like saying stuff to me about like the Southern values and like how it's gonna be like how it'll be like so different from the North, and like kind of like those stereotypes, and coming here kind of made me realize like it's not, like I like challenge those, and I realized like, oh, it's not true. So when I go back home and people are like asking me about it, and like just the different things I experience, I'm like, it's really like it's not different as much as like you think it might be.
One thing is
Food
that
might be better.
Yeah.
Florida, I think, is like, I don't know if you've ever heard this, when you go get to Florida, you only get more north, you only go more north, because Florida is not like, there's no Southern culture in Florida.
Like I said, people, I'm like,
Florida's
it's
very
really not
Southern.
that.
Yeah, yeah, I live in Tallahassee, Northern Florida is not really, I mean, I think universities are always protected too. If you go like 30 minutes outside of this university, here you'll get rural Southern people. And so, yeah, and like.
I think if you go more south, like towards Orlando.
No, south of here is, I'm
but then more
south
north
of here is northern,
yeah.
but north of here in the rural pockets is very Southern, and all up in the Panhandle is crazy Southern. Like Southern, thick on, very thick Southern accents, and it's South Georgia, South Alabama more than it seems. I mean, having grown up in Miami, it doesn't seem like the Florida I grew up in, but it is Florida, but it is Southern.
So Florida started having plantation conferences in the 1980s and 90s, and they were all in northern Florida. And in other words, like the South was north here, in a real.
I mean, they hide it. We have like places in Tallahassee that were formerly plantations, now they come with gardens and have plantings there. Yeah.
Do they have Civil War sites in Florida that they celebrate?
You can go to Alusty, in between Jacksonville and Tallahassee. They do a reenactment every year.
I would see that as changing with African American history. No.
Well, that's where the 54th Massachusetts fought, so they make a big deal out of that. But a lot of people like to dress up as the Confederates, as they do everywhere else. I mean, I taught at UNF, and
I did have those students who were, states' rights, and this is how my family's always done it, and, I'm a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and my mom's in D.C., and so, and I wasn't really participating in that.
And we loved our servants.
Yes, of course.
They always sneer at these reenactments, and I say sometimes we need to think about their longer-term consequences. Like Drew Faust tells the story of her brothers always making her be a Union person. So she had to play General Grant. And you see, you grow up being a president of Harvard. I mean, just resist. It can be a really good lesson for you as Southern women.
Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate this conversation.